So Spider-Man No Way Home is finally here, and as I was expecting, there were a lot of flaws in its plot. But there were also some really awesome things that I could have never seen it coming. I could have never expected this movie to have such great moments and such massive flaws at the same time, and yet those great moments prevent me from thinking that this movie was a total disaster despite its plot being so broken. So given that the good things about No Way Home are so amazing, and yet its flaws are so terrible, and it almost sounds so confusing, I think the best way to express my thoughts about this movie is to narrate it from start to finish. So with that being said, let's talk about it. So the movie starts with Mysterio revealing Spider-Man's real identity to the whole world, and now Spider-Man becomes sort of a publicly hated figure or something. I just think it's baffling that the people will turn their backs on Spider-Man after Peter Parker being Spider-Man for quite some time because of Mysterio, who presented himself as a hero just like that. But given that Nick Fury was actually a Skrull back in Far From Home, then it wasn't really a smart decision to leave planet Earth and put an alien to replace him in such an important and vital position, only for it to culminate in Skrull Nick Fury being fooled by an ordinary human being pretending to be a hero from the multiverse or whatever, and also for it to culminate in Nick Fury being unable to help a falsely incriminated Peter Parker, was it? Peter Parker is arrested and he seems to be in a helpless situation. So here we are, Charlie Cox returns as Daredevil, and he was great. It was really nice to see him as Mad Maroc once again. It's been a while since I last watched Daredevil, back when its amazing Season 3 was released a few years ago, and it was awesome to see him again. Then he catches a brick out of nowhere, Peter Parker is astonished, and that scene was really cool, and that's basically it, and we won't see more of Mad Maroc for literally the rest of the movie. Peter, MJ, and Ed's college applications were denied due to the recent events involving Spider-Man's identity, which leads Peter to seek Doctor Strange for help. And that is the one segment responsible for the existence of the conflict that will push the plot of No Way Home forward. And it was painful to see. Peter Parker wants to go back in time in order to make Mysterio never reveal his identity. Doctor Strange doesn't look optimistic at first, and he also doesn't have the Time Stone anymore, when suddenly he comes up with an ancient spell. And he says the name of the spell that was Wong's first reaction.
That spell travels the dark borders between known and unknown reality. It's too dangerous.
So considering what Wong has said about this spell, and also how Doctor Strange has dealt with such great situations involving space and time since his first movie, and given how careful he is whenever using his powers as it was shown in previous movies, then why on earth is he considering to make use of such spell that deals with the unknown, whose consequences may be catastrophic if one tiny thing goes wrong? Why didn't he tell Peter about the world with no exceptions, forgetting that he is Spider-Man? Why is he not talking about such vital information that is absolutely of Peter Parker's concern of his loved ones completely forgetting about his Spider-Man identity? Why would Doctor Strange proceed to make the spell without warning him that there are no exceptions and his loved ones will forget that he is Spider-Man? Why wouldn't Doctor Strange consider Peter Parker's concern for his family and friends and just proceed to make the spell anyway? If Doctor Strange knows that Peter Parker is just a kid, like he tells him after the spell goes wrong, then why didn't he tell Peter about such essential information about the consequences and risks the spell entails before making the actual spell, just in case Peter would get too anxious and talkative, thus making Doctor Strange lose his concentration during the spell? And why wouldn't Doctor Strange include himself as an exception to the spell?
Look how they massacred my boy.
As you can see, it was painful. However, Marvel needed the multiverse to happen, and if to make the multiverse a thing with the Raimi trilogy and the Mark Webb movies was only possible by a character assassinating Doctor Strange into doing such dumb decisions he would never ever do if Doctor Strange were to behave in a character, to the point of using a spell that is so dangerous for dealing with the unknown, so be it! Because not long after that, here it is, the multiverse, first shown in No Way Home through Doc Ock breaking through the bridge with his tentacle blades.
Don't ask questions, just consume product and then get excited for next product.
So Doc Ock is mad at Peter Parker and starts asking him about what he has done to his machine. I get the hype behind this scene, but it makes absolutely no sense. Because it shows that Doc Ock is still a villain despite knowing Spider-Man's real identity as Peter Parker, which is the very opposite of how it happened in the Raimi trilogy. First, Doc Ock only knows that Spider-Man is Peter Parker when Tobey Maguire's Peter Parker reveals his identity to Doc Ock. The moment he does that, Doc Ock's memories are taken to when he first met Peter Parker. During this moment, Doc Ock seems to be at ease and to be the nice man he actually was before his experiment went wrong. Even though he still struggles with the influence of his tentacle blades on his brain when Peter talks about destroying his machine, otherwise New York City would be destroyed, Peter Parker, by revealing who he was behind Spider-Man's mask, managed to bring back to the surface the kind of good horror man Doc Ock was, which was being suppressed by his tentacle blades. And thanks to those aspects of his original personality being awakened by Peter, Doc Ock manages to fight against the influence of his tentacle blades and overcomes it. He destroys his machine and dies a noble death. I loved this segment in Spider-Man 2. It was great and emotional, it was the perfect way to conclude Doc Ock's character arc and one of my favorite moments of the Raimi trilogy. And of course, No Way Home just had to get it wrong, because we need stakes in some MCU Peter Parker vs. Doc Ock fights, I guess.
You're not Peter Parker.
Couldn't he have figured this out earlier when MCU Peter Parker wears a completely different suit in this scene from the one Peter Parker wears in the Raimi trilogy, if having mechanical arms at his back wasn't enough? Not to mention MCU Peter Parker's voice, personality, and body language being completely different from Tobey Maguire's Peter Parker. So Peter Parker does a thing with his suit, and now he has full control over Doc Ock's tentacle blades. Doc Ock looks completely pathetic in this scene as Peter moves his tentacle blades around, giggling. Now the MIT lady is all about Peter Parker being a hero because she was saved by Spider-Man, but didn't people see Spider-Man save people before?
You're the Spider-Man from YouTube.
Now, Doctor Strange is talking about how the spell ended up bringing everyone who knows who Spider-Man is into our universe because Peter Parker screwed everything up. Except that the Doctor Strange was the one who came up with the idea to make use of the spell to begin with, despite Wong's warnings, despite knowing the risks, and despite everything he went through involving space and time ever since he was shown this whole new reality he was never aware of back in his first movie. But sure, just blame Peter Parker for being seriously concerned about everyone he loves forgetting that he is Spider-Man while not being told about everything the spell entails. This is also tiresome.
Scooby-Doo this shit.
You're telling us what to do, even though it was your spell that got screwed up, meaning that all this is kind of your mess.
Thank you!
We are taken to the Green Goblin, and Norman is struggling against the Green Goblin's influence to the point of destroying the Green Goblin's mask. Aunt May calls Peter, saying that someone is looking for him. Peter desperately goes to where she works because he thinks that she is in danger, only to find Aunt May having a nice chat with Norman Osborn. In this scene, Norman Osborn is just a tiny needy man, like a patient who needs psychological assistance. He talks about how the Green Goblin controls him, he can't remember anything once he is under his control, his company is gone. It pretty much reminded me of Loki's characterization in his own show, like how Loki becomes this needy sentimental man right after invading the city with a huge alien army to conquer Earth, because instead of being a needy man pleading for help like in No Way Home, Norman Osborn will resort to become the Green Goblin to take out his enemies like he did in a military base and at a festival where he killed the people who wanted to sell his own company. He will dive deeper and deeper into the Green Goblin's control whenever he couldn't destroy his enemies as Norman Osborn. And at the background, he is seen grabbing some donuts, I guess, like an unhinged person or something.
Look at the mask with my boy.
Then all the other villains of the other movies talk about how Doc Ock and Green Goblin died, and Doc Ock says this.
I had him by the throat, and then I was here.
Which means that not only did this movie get Doc Ock still being a villain when Tobey Maguire's Peter Parker reveals his identity wrong, given that the moment Peter Parker reveals his identity is when Doc Ock's redemption begins, as I've already said, but also that I think it's safe to say that Doc Ock being taken to the MCU's universe eventually affected the outcome of the climax back at the end of Spider-Man 2.
It was all over the news. Green Goblin impaled by the glider.
How could Sandman possibly know this, that Norman Osborn was Green Goblin, and that he was impaled by his own glider? Not even Harry, his own son, would know that his father was a Green Goblin until the end of Spider-Man 2 when he finds out that Spider-Man was Peter, and that his father died by his own hand until Spider-Man 3 when his butler talks about Norman Osborn's wounds as a way to imply that Norman Osborn was responsible for his own death, and that it wasn't Spider-Man's fault like Harry had thought ever since the end of Spider-Man 1. There was supposed to be a private and yet vital information about Norman Osborn, and the truth about it would have impactful consequences to our characters back in the Raimi trilogy. Plus, there was no corpse for Green Goblin given that Norman Osborn was Green Goblin. How could the people and the news possibly know about the Green Goblin's wounds being caused by his own glider when his body was taken by Peter to Norman's own apartment without his Green Goblin suit? No one should have known that but the people who were the closest to Norman, like his butler, Peter Parker, and then Harry Osborn. So Peter Parker doesn't want him to die, so he runs away with this magic box Doctor Strange brought to reverse his spell. How could Peter Parker control his body while being in his astral form? And Doctor Strange is just sort of there, as Peter Parker just swims back to his body, but honestly such a thing shouldn't even be possible. But don't worry, it gets worse. A chase scene happens and Doctor Strange uses his powers to create a reality where he is in control, to stop Peter Parker and retrieve the box. But surprise, surprise, Peter Parker manages to outsmart his incredible powers by using math.
No! God, please, no! No!
So it turns out that Norman Osborn's Green Goblin was still there, and Peter Parker senses it. Norman attacks Peter Parker, and Electro says that he likes being the bad guy better or whatever, and then he attacks Doc Ock, and during the mayhem, the Lizard also escapes. During his fight against the Green Goblin, Norman throws a grenade, and May seems fine at first, then she collapses, and then she dies. It was an emotional scene. I think Tom Holland did a great job during this specific moment. It was touching and sad, and the instrumental score enhanced those sad feelings even more. And I think that's the moment this movie starts getting good after the plot being so badly broken so far. Also, the scene of a teary-eyed Peter Parker watching the Daily Bugle claiming that everything's Spider-Man's fault while he just lost his Aunt May was crushing and sad. He just lost a loved one, and yet he watches in horror as he's still blamed for everything. So MJ wants to press the button of that magic box Peter stole from Doctor Strange, but then Ned does a thing with his hand, and it turns out that Ned has powers. And he opens up a portal which brings Andrew Garfield's Spider-Man into their world. And this was actually very, very funny. So Ned does his thing again, and now Tobey Maguire's Peter Parker is here, and he says that he has this feeling that he needs to help Tom Holland's Peter Parker. The moment they all find Tom Holland's Peter Parker was amazing. The movie doesn't cease to show Peter's sadness for losing Aunt May just to make a funny scene of all three versions of Spider-Man meeting each other for the first time or whatever. He just climbed down the tower they were on top of silently and tried to help Tom Holland's Peter to go through this darkness for losing Aunt May. We are allowed to have a great moment of the three versions of Spider-Man gathering together without losing its sad tone due to what just happened to Aunt May. They talk about who they've lost and what they felt after the deaths of Uncle Ben and Gwen Stacy. It was both sad and beautiful. The dialogue of Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield's Peter Parker trying to help Tom Holland's Peter Parker with his grief was so touching and emotional. Their performances were wonderful, and I'm thankful for Marvel allowing us to feel that, and this moment was executed in a really awesome way. And also the instrumental score here was great once again. But that didn't last long. Once all three versions of Spider-Man start coming up with a plan to stop all the bad guys, Ned asks Tobey Maguire's Peter Parker if he has a best friend, to which he responds that he did, and he died in his arms after trying to kill him. Which is simply not true. Because we all know that Harry Osborn died next to his best friends, Peter and Mary Jane, after going through his redemption. He was not trying to kill Peter, but in fact he saved him from being killed by Eddie Brock in Spider-Man 3. After his last fight with Peter, Harry realizes that Peter wasn't to be blamed for his father's death. He then saves Peter from being smashed to death by Sandman. Harry and Peter fight Eddie together to save Mary Jane, and sacrifices his own life to save his best friend from getting impaled. Harry's death was one of the most emotional moments for me throughout the Raimi trilogy. It was wonderfully executed and heartbreaking, and the fact that it gets barefacely retconned and turned into a silly funny moment in No Way Home is pathetic. Even if Tobey Maguire's Peter Parker was talking about it when Harry tried to kill Peter at the beginning of Spider-Man 3, why would he say that when his final redemption and sacrifice are more impactful and powerful things about his best friend's story? Or is it because we needed to have a funny scene of Ned scared of becoming evil and killing Peter? This kind of humor is so bad and so old that we can actually see it from miles and miles away. So the final fight happens against Electro, Sandman, and the Lizard. The three versions of Spider-Man manage to inject them with the cure and they are saved. But Green Goblin shows up and the final showdown between Tom Holland's Peter Parker and Norman Osborn takes place. Peter Parker goes for the kill, but Tobey Maguire's Peter Parker prevents him from becoming a murderer, but he is stabbed by the Green Goblin, and I was so mad if Tobey Maguire's Peter Parker really died in No Way Home. I can't stress that enough. Peter asks Doctor Strange to come up with a spell to make every single person forget who he is because it was the only way to stop the multiverse from collapsing or something. Doctor Strange agrees, although he is sad for Peter and what the future has in store for him with all his loved ones not knowing who he is. The spell is done and he says his final goodbye to the other versions of Spider-Man, Nat, and MJ. It was beautiful, touching, and sad, and it hit me in the feels more than I could have thought. The movie ends with Peter Parker rehearsing what he's going to say to MJ to make her remember him, only for him to give up on that idea and move on. It was a touching and poignant ending for Spider-Man, and I think that it played out really, really well. And that's it for Spider-Man No Way Home. There were some moments that were truly amazing throughout this movie. I loved the interactions of all three versions of Spider-Man. Their chemistry was so great, I can't get enough of that. It was great to see Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield's Peter Parkers having a chat about their personal lives, to see the three of them talking about the villains they fought, and Andrew fixing Tobey's back was really funny. It was touching to see Andrew Garfield's Peter Parker try not to break down in tears when he saves MJ, and their final hug was so sweet and emotional. Those three together was easily my favorite thing about No Way Home, and definitely the one thing that prevents me from thinking that this movie was a complete disaster despite its massive flaws. Thanks to those three, we've had some great, emotional, and funny moments, and I loved every single moment of that. William Dafoe and Molina's performances as Green Goblin and Doc Ock respectively were great. I simply loved the dialogue of Doc Ock with Tobey Maguire's Peter Parker. It was so wonderful. Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield were also amazing as their respective Peter Parkers, and some instrumental scores were really good. However, this movie still had some flaws that were absolutely terrible. Just as I expected, since when the first No Way Home trailer dropped, the main reason why the conflict that pushes the plot of No Way Home forward exists is because Doctor Strange gets character assassinated by making a stupid off-character decision. If Doctor Strange's characterization were to be consistent with the previous movies he was in, No Way Home would either not exist or the plot would turn out to be completely different. But Phase 4 needed to have the multiverse, so off Marvel Phase 4 goes, character assassinating Doctor Strange into doing dumb stuff he would otherwise never ever do for the sake of bringing the multiverse into this movie. He also gets defeated by Peter in such a painful, dumb way. Some characterizations and facts were retconned in order to fit the plot of No Way Home. We had funny scenes at the cost of undermining great and impactful moments in some previous Spider-Man movies, and most of the villains were absolutely wasted, especially Lizard, who was just there doing nothing for most of this 2.5-hour long movie. Spider-Man No Way Home was definitely a hard movie to evaluate. The fact is, I believe that most of the plot of No Way Home is absolutely broken due to how bad and convoluted it is. But the good parts of the plot were just so great, they managed to prevent me from hating it and thinking that it was an absolute disaster. I cannot undermine the good moments just because of its flaws, just like I can turn a blind eye to its massive flaws just because of the good aspects of the movie. But No Way Home absolutely nailed the good things about it, and for that, I am truly grateful. So that's it for today's video. Thank you for watching, and if you like my content, consider subscribing, and I'll see you next time around.